So I think we should just start. Welcome everyone to the afternoon session of the second day of Tartalo. We are very, very happy to have you here as listeners, and to thank you also to the online speakers who are joining us today from a couple of different places. In this panel, we have 3 speakers. Please remember that your talk should be concise to 15 minutes each, and then if it's all right with all of you, we will do the Q&A afterwards. So without further ado, Alicia, if you could share your screen while your PowerPoint while I present you.
Yes, I will try. I need some to tell me if you can see it.
Yes. In theory, you
can
should...
you see it?
Yeah. You should be
okay.
able to. Mm-hmm. Could you share it on...
Sorry. A minute, yeah. Can you see the slides moving?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
So our first speaker is Alicia Martinez Martin, and she holds a degree in English Studies and a Master in Comparative Literature and Literary Studies from the University of the Basque Country, and she's currently undergoing her PhD thesis here. Her main interests reside in the analysis of totalitarian regimes portrayed in dystopian and speculative fiction of English-speaking countries, with a special emphasis in the oppression and commodification of women and their dispossession of identity, rights, and freedom. And her talk today, as you can see there, is Under His Eye She Rises: Lilith, the Shadow Beast, and the Return of the Rebel Woman in The Handmaid's Tale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you so much to the organizing committee, because I am really glad to be here one more year presenting my study. As you have said, my study revolves around the myth of Lilith, the archetype of the shadow beast, and how these two may be applied to Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. This is the table of contents that I'm going to follow, a brief introduction of what the research gap and the aims that I've found, and then very briefly I will present The Handmaid's Tale, so in case some of you don't know what that's about, you have a small hint, and then I will introduce Lilith and the Shadow Beast. Then point 5 will be the actual analysis, how I do apply this to The Handmaid's Tale, and later we will delve into conclusions and the works cited section. So Atwood's novel has been, not only The Handmaid's Tale, but in general, every single one of Atwood's novels have been approached through this mythical, symbolic dimension, but mostly from more the psychological, social, cultural dimensions. So I think it will be great to come back to this mythical, symbolic dimension, especially in this conference, in order to exemplify how there are forms of female rebellion that may transcend the current dominant patriarchal narrative, and how these forms of female rebellion has also been hand in hand with the patriarchal narrative since ancient times, and how they have been reconfiguring themselves along the way. For me, myths and archetypes are semiotic units, function as symbolic systems through which societies negotiate not only questions of order, but also identity, gender, agency, power. But not only that, for me also it's a means to trace how these dominant ideologies are shaped, but are also shaped by cultural memory, and how this cultural memory later is embedded into how we perceive the world around us in general. So this study precisely aims at addressing how Atwood's narrative reconfigures these mythic archetypes to articulate these transhistorical forms of rebellion. And I do it through Lilith and the Shadow Beast, as I've told you before. Very briefly, The Handmaid's Tale was published in 1985. It was written during the conservative resurgence of the 80s. It was published during Ronald Reagan's presidency that was from 1981 to 1999. And in this novel, Margaret Atwood tries to reimagine these dominant structures we talked about before through speculative fiction in order to expose how these patriarchal narratives are still existent and how they're still persistent and impacting women's bodies and identities, also delving a little bit into biopolitics as well. In this case, The Handmaid's Tale projects, but also exaggerates a plausible society, and I say plausible because everything that appears is based on real historical antecedents that happened somewhere in the world before, to construct the Republic of Gilead, where mainly the main plot or the main issue of the plot is that women's agency, especially in the handmaids, is reduced to their capacity to bear or not to bear children for the regime. There to the right, you have some of the illustrations of different categorizations of women in this society. Then, how is the myth of Lilith constructed? Because I think it's very important to see how it's been updating itself since the Judaic, Mesopotamian, and Greco-Roman mythology, where we have the very first instances of Lilith, to, for example, the 19th century. In the first instances, we have that she was perceived not as a woman, but more like a nocturnal animal, more like a night demoness, linked to folklore and to mysticism in general, but not really to religious terms. However, in the Middle Ages, this shifts when she is first linked to the Holy Scriptures. For example, we have in the 10th century the alphabet of Ben Sira, when she is firstly presented as Adam's first wife. She doesn't want to be subdued, and she rejects this patriarchal oppression, let's say. So she is demonized and presented as the example of how women should not behave. Then in the 12th century Midrash, in one of them, we have this dual cosmology, for most of the first time presented between good, bad, or the masculine, the feminine. And Lilith here is also presented as a sexually voracious demonist figure, now linking her not only to this rebellious nature, but also to sexual matters, demonizing that in her as well. And then in the 18th century, we have, for example, in Goethe's Fausto, Lilith presented as someone whose beauty is perilous and whose nursement. Or in the 19th century, for example, we have the coining of the term femme fatale to refer to this kind of women. In this sense, Lilith is a victim, but also a survivor of this cultural rewriting. It's like a mythic archive of women's rebellion, but she's never able to fully achieve this rebellion. She is stuck all the time in the idea because she is demonized. So I think I see this counterpoint, or Lilith's counterpoint, in Ansaldua's The Shadow Beast, because this idea is finally reimagined as a locus of transformation through which we can have real, tangible action to change something in society, or at least to try. So the Shadow Beast, in this sense, embodies its Lilith's psychological and political rebirth. This term was coined by Ansaldúa in Borderlands La Frontera, New Mestiza, in 1987. And she's born out of the necessity of resisting and, in a way, kind of fighting these cultures which betray women or Chicanas or lesbian or any single individual that has been kind of pushed to the margins of society. So in this sense, Ansaldúa suggests that this force, that doesn't have to be inherent in every single woman, but is more like a cultural force, must be faced and integrated in order to live authentically. How then I apply this to mythical or archetypal figures, to The Handmaid's Tale? This novel presents different female characters, and all of them appear under circumstances of oppression, sexual violence, censorship, and also the demands of motherhood. Not all of them are under the same circumstances, but oppression is the common thread among all of them. So I thought it would be great to allude to Aristotle's metaphysics when he presents the idea and the action as the potentiality and the actuality. Because I think Lilith is this representation of rebelliousness, but it's not like the real tangible action itself. It's just more like the motive that can push forward the actual action. So for me, Lilith is framed as this personification of history, while the shadow piece is the action itself that can change things, socially speaking. The first of these women in the Handmaid's Tale that I want to analyze is Offred. And I think that she does not only in this transformative journey, because I think she's one of the most transformative characters in the whole novel, she doesn't only embody Lilith or the Shadow Beast, but also Eve, because at first she is presented to us as this kind of obedient girl. She doesn't want to make any sound. She doesn't want to disturb or to break any boundaries, because her main aim is to remain. As you can see there in bold in the first quotation, we have waste not, want not. I'm not being wasted. Why do I want? Not only there, but we also have these verbal allusions to religion in the second quote, for example, may the Lord open. However, she, in the Republic of Gilead, for example, thinking it's not permitted because it means it's more perceived like a threat. So whenever she starts thinking, even though at first she says she doesn't want to do it because she intends to last, we find that along the whole story, she is all the time thinking, and she's all the time revisiting memory and feeling the time she has lost for whatever reason. So here I see Lilith coming in because she's kind of rebelling against some of the norms of the regime. Also, when she does this, she starts to be a little frightened because she has not crossed any boundaries physically, but she has done it like symbolically. She now can see that transpassing these boundaries, she can find a way out, a salvation. So I think this is the first part in which she starts to being kind of disobedient, kind of rebellious, but it's not until when she really lets the shadow beast out, when she really makes actual changes or lets actual possibilities to appear, to dismantle or at least to try to dismantle Gilead from within. Here, offered as the shadow beast, she tries to do whatever the circumstances allow her to do because it's a very oppressive system. You cannot do whatever you want. She, for example, finds this power in moving her hips in front of the guardians. And she knows it's a passive power, but still she's her body into real action. But I think one of the most clear examples of this shadow beast coming out is when she is establishing alliances with other handmaids in order to try to dismantle the Republic of Gilead, when she is in the Mayday network. She is now doing something rebellious that can actually make this change, socially speaking. So that's why I think Offred undergoes the most transformative journey. However, then we have Moira. Moira is one of the most confrontive characters since the very beginning of the novel. However, she ends up being all the opposite. For me, she starts being more like the shadow beast because she's like the fantasy of every single handmaid. She represents this rebelliousness. She kicks an ounce. She tries to escape. She almost fulfills in it. But then she is repressed, oppressed, punished, and she ends up being just Lilith, she's still rebellious in the way she speaks, but she is no longer able to take real action to change anything. And this is something that terrifies the protagonist. She says that she sees indifference and a lack of volition in someone that was so combative. So for me, it's very representative of how this rebelliousness it's also very limited by the social boundaries in general, but in special in this oppressive society. And then we have Serena Joy. For me, this is very also representative of how in society in general, Lilith and the Shadow Beast doesn't have to be inherent in every single woman. It's more like a cultural thing. So Serena Joy is completely far away from Lilith or the Shadow Beast, but she is portraying the patriarchy the ways in which patriarchy oppresses and also is perpetuated by the oppressed. As Ansaldúa herself says, culture is made by those in power, in this case men, and even though they make the rules, women are the ones transmitting them onto new generations of male and women. So Serena Joy's character adopts in a way patriarchal values to secure her own place, but also I think she's not really aware of how things are going to end up because she comes from a privileged position. She doesn't have, or she hasn't been living the same kind of troubles or social situations that, for example, Moira, Offred, or Offred's mother, for example, may have experienced. So she's a little bit far away and distant from Lilith and the Shadow Beast. She is what Mary Daly described as token woman. She is portraying these special roles in these cultures that are being, these women are being instrumentalized for patriarchal purposes. So even though she were having these speeches where women should be left at home, she ends up being left at home with no voice at all, which is very representative of how token women are not really privileged, but just part of the instrumentalization through which patriarchy works. So this character illustrates how patriarchy needs these also females to survive when they internalize its structures. And also this leads to framing narratives which end up anchored in the collective imagery. And I go back to the very beginning when I say that this were shaping cultural memory. Everything that is there is being affected by what happened before, but it's also accepting every single thing that comes later. For example, in terms of cultural production, in terms of TV series, movies, songs, any single thing that can come to your mind. So now arriving already to the conclusions, I think I'm in time. Lilith and the Shadow Beast act as historical and cultural frameworks which guide fictional women, not all of them, but some of the characters, toward truth, agency, and also autonomy. Lilith embodies the historical but never realized memory of resistance, and this unrealization is now realized through the Shadow Beast, where Ansaldúa is able to take this meaning and reinscribe it, taking what culture has marked as monstrous, ugly, demonic, especially women, and it confers new meanings to it, filled with other categories like power, will, freedom, nothing demonic or ugly in general. Offred's trajectory is the most transformative. She is a female figure in which she gathers this broad spectrum of archetypal femininities, all of them coexisting in the same individual. Also being very telling about how this cultural process is evolving even inside of one person. Then Moira was presented as the most confrontative characters, but she undergoes the inverse journey, and this is mainly marked by Gilead's harsh conditions. And Serena Joy is all the opposite. She is the perfect example of historical manipulation and of the instrumentalization of women as weapons of patriarchy, exemplifying what Daly labeled as token women. These are my works cited, my images cited, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for your presentation. We will now move on to Martín. If you want to share your screen, please, or your presentation. Martín Praga is a PhD candidate, teacher and researcher affiliated with the Universidade da Coruña, and he recently completed a research visit at Villanova University in Pennsylvania, where he further explored socially engaged poetry. His research focuses on the intersection of experimental and political poetry in contemporary North America. He curated the creative writing section for issue 86 of the Revista Canaria de Estudios Ingleses, called Toxic Tales, Narratives of Waste in Post-Industrial North America. and his presentation today is called Magical Realism as, it was called, it's now called World Making Without Elsewhere, Magical Realism in Speculative Poetry. Whenever you want, Martin, the floor is yours.
Now,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you.
We can
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you. I want to thank the committee. Yes, I'm sharing in a second. For rescheduling my presentation. Let's see if I can make this work. Now, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Amazing. Give me a second. There we go. So, over the past 2 decades, the term speculative has moved from a niche tag to a shared shorthand across publishing, conferences, and classrooms. What has changed is not just the market for wonder and estrangement, but the vocabulary we use to describe them. In poetry, speculative has become a way of testing knowledge, ethics, and world building. In fact, a way of world making without elsewhere. The term recalls speculative fiction, popularized with Margaret Atwood as writing about things that really could happen. But the definition risks leaving out the forms of speculation that blur the boundary between the real and the marvelous. And it's precisely in those blurred zones that some of today's socially engaged poetry finds traction. Speculative poetry already encompasses a wide range of subgenres, from dystopia to steampunk and urban myth. Yet most criticism has focused on science fiction. Beneath the surface, though, runs a quieter current, magical realism, often in dialogue with the fantastic. Like other speculative modes, magical realism works through estrangement, but it offers its own tools for reimagining political and cultural realities, tools that keep the marvelous grounded in the social and material world. Writing about magical realism in poetry also means retooling frameworks borrowed from fiction. Without the scaffolding of plot or character, poetic versions of the marvelous work through other means, through material anchoring, communal address, ritual form, or matter-of-fact tone that treats the impossible as ordinary. These techniques remind us that speculation in poetry is often less about invention than about perception. In this still under-theorized field, Margaret Ronda has proposed what she calls the social form of speculative poetics, 5 recurring ways in which poems imagine otherwise, through world building, negation, wish fulfillment, temporal discontinuity, and future thinking. I take these forms not as fixed categories, but as verbs, as ways in which poems act. They offer a vocabulary for tracing how different speculative modes reimagine social and material realities from within. To see how these modalities first emerge, it helps to begin with the most visible lineage, that of science fiction. Ronda's modalities, in fact, resonate most directly with its logic. Carl Friedman once defined science fiction as writing that moves readers beyond the boundaries of their own mundane environment into strange, awe-inspiring realms thought to be unknown, but not unknowable. Adam Roberts adds that science fiction is a multivalent and endlessly cross-fertilizing cultural idiom, a mode through which marginalized groups imagine otherwise. Then that science become the most visible speculative mode. As Rams notes, futurist aesthetics have long flourished in fiction, film, and music, but rarely in verse. Poets such as Tracy Morris and Tracy K. Smith changed that landscape. In her sequence, Afrofuturistic, Morris fuses sound poetry with science fictional imagery, androids cloning data, and disembodied voices to stage Black feminism resistance to algorithmic capture. The sequence reclaims the poem as a performative site where syntax and breath undo linguistic hierarchies. Tracy K. Smith, by contrast, turns elegiac. In Life on Mars, outer space becomes a site of mourning and ethical imagination, a way to rehumanize the future through grief. Her speakers look up at the cosmos, but not for escape, but to measure what persists of us in there. The speculative lens magnifies loss, asking whether technological wonder can coexist with tenderness. Douglas Kearney's The Black Automaton transforms lyric into circuitry. Words as wires, typeface as feedback, robots, math, and coded speech become methods of persistence, a poetic of black noise that performs both automation and its refusal. The recent anthology, The Future is Black, collects an entire generation of poets writing through sci-fi idioms, cybernetics, mythic, planetary, while grounding them in Black futuristic thought. Its pages confirm that speculative poetics are no longer marginal, but that they have become a shared lexicon for reimagining race, technology, and time itself. Science fiction imaginaries also shape Asian American poetry, especially in Sally Wen Mao, Franny Choi, and Kathy Park Hong. Mao's Oculus uses the art of Nam June Paik on screen to explore visibility and surveillance. Her time-traveling recurring character, Anna May Wong, rewrites cinematic history with agency and irony. Franny Choi in Soft Science and The World Keeps Ending and The World Goes On folds apocalypse into the everyday. Her cyborg speakers navigate intimacy and catastrophe as parallel systems. The speculative here is tactile, embodied, language and circuitry sharing the same pulse. And Hong's Engine Empire, which I will mention again later, fuses the Western, dystopian, magical realism into a single speculative continuum. More importantly, all these examples highlight the primacy of science fiction in the imaginary of speculative poetry, but they also reveal a persistent engagement with other, less theorized modes central to socially committed poetics. After science fiction, the most visible traces of speculative in contemporary poetry appear to be, at first glance, fantastic. Fantasy, of course, conjures its most iconic tropes: dragons, invented worlds, epic quests. But such high fantasy is largely absent from poetry. What we find instead are moments of estrangement, often legible through Todorov's Fantastic, where the natural and supernatural coexist in hesitation, or through magical realism, where the marvelous is treated as culturally legible within the real. Sharon Stieber's claim that fantasy and magical realism belong to the same guild helps clarify how these modes intersect. Following Rosemary Jackson, we can think of fantasy as a mode where subversion happens through uncertainty, through thematic slippage and pressure and closure. It foregrounds metamorphosis and doubling, and it tends to remain politically ambivalent. Magical realism, by contrast, works through confidence rather than doubt. As Wendy Faris has shown, it anchors the marvelous in material description, merges distinct realms that let time and identity loosen without collapse. The result is a reality thickened rather than displaced. Its magic is never ornamental, it's matter-of-fact, socially legible, and culturally grounded. This doubleness, the marvelous as both real and metaphorical, has long fueled debates about whether magical realism in fiction is inherently political or merely stylistic. In poetry, I think the question feels largely settled by the work itself. Magical realism operates as a socially in charge and formally subversive mode whose politics emerge not from content alone, but from the very operations they organize. To see how these operations unfold in practice, I want to turn from what magical realism is to what it does in recent poetry. Across contemporary collections, we can trace how the marvelous structures poetic form and social meaning at once, how it rebuilds reality not through invention, but through reconfiguration. Following Ronda's modalities, we can explore how magical realism performs speculation as social practice. For Ronda, world building in speculative poetics names the construction of alternative ontologies within the social world rather than beyond it. It's not an escapist gesture, but a reconfiguration of what already exists, a form of imaginative repair. J. Michael Martinez's The Curanderas Tale of Agave Bloom transforms family tragedy into a cosmology. The poem follows generations of the Beltran family, whose fate is bound to a single agave plant. When the curandera plants 2 seashells for a newborn, the desert itself begins to speak. The child's first words make the agave bloom. From that point on, language, inheritance, and ritual fuse into one system of meaning. As Faris notes, magical realism merges distinct realms until they are materially continuous. Martinez rebuilds the world through that continuity, enacting what Ronda calls a social form of speculation, world building, a historical repair. Ronda defines negation as poetry's refusal of giving orders of sense. In documentary and conceptual work, think for example of Norbert Philip's song, negation often takes the form of subtraction and erasure of the archive. Read against those precedents, magical realism performs a different kind of refusal. Rather than exiting the real, it recalls it from within. The poem treats the marvelous as communal fact, and in doing so, it negates the epistemic boundaries that restrict reality to the empirically verifiable. This epistemic refusal also links magical realism to contemporary ecopoetic. Ronda knows that ecopoetic work stage imaginative encounters with non-human entities and remaindered materials. And that insight echoes Begoña Siman's description of magical realism as an extended realism that unsettles the binaries of human and non-human, nature and culture. Aimee Netzeku Matatil's Oceanic abounds with such moments. Poems like Self-Portrait as a Scallop or Self-Portrait as Niagara Falls in Winter, where metamorphosis becomes a mode of empathy. Here, the lyric voice is not transcendent, but relational. It undoes the hierarchy that separates human from non-human, self from world. This is negation as reclamation, not the deletion of meaning, but the recovery of other ways of knowing. In Ronda's terms, wish fulfillment is the social form where poems test desire and their constraint. It's not utopian escape, it's a controlled, momentary redress that happens inside history. In Eve L. Ewing's Electric Arches, the bracketed retelling pieces do exactly that. They replace scenes of racialized harm and open a small breach where another outcome becomes briefly possible. The breach isn't an elsewhere. It's a pause in the same world, an altered beat that protects a Black child, reverses a humiliation, or suspends an act of violence. Ewing's recording let this wish appear, but discipline it. The surrounding social conditions remain legible, the fantasy is measured, no totalizing. That is wish fulfillment as tactic, not as destination. If a poem refuses the easy wish, it must retime the world. Bending chronology and pressures points of history rise to the surface. For Ronda, temporal discontinuity names poetry's interruption of a linear time. Jump cuts, recursive returns, anachronisms, simultaneities that make uneven histories palpable. In socially engaged work, time appears as rubble and remainder, trauma persisting in the present, future arriving unevenly, so form breaks chronology to register what official narratives smooth over. This continuity becomes not an ornament, but historical method. The poem exposes multiple, competing clocks, capital, empire, ritual, catastrophe running at once. As Frederick Jameson writes, postmodernism often organizes time as nostalgia, flattening history into style. Magical realism, by contrast, mobilizes historical raw material to stage historical understanding. Morisco Wayne Guevara's poems retell Colombian history through magical reconfiguration, while similar porous temporalities emerge in Maida Vang's Afterland, where national trauma is mediated by ancestral present. The history of the Hmong people does not stay past. As Farish reminds us, there is no idiosyncratic recreations these are idiosyncratic recreations of historical events, alternate versions of officially sanctioned accounts. In Ronda's terms, this locates temporal discontinuity and future thinking at the speculative core. Science fiction projects forward, but magical realism bends time inward, turning futurity into historical pressure. Temporal discontinuity marks where we are, then future thinking asks where a poem lets us go. For Ronda, it is an orientation to the horizon, survival plans, counter-predictions, provisional programs, undertaken under history's drag. As Simal notes, magical realist works often choose ambiguous closure that keep destruction and survival in intention. The future appears not as a blueprint or prophecy, but as continuance, ritual, kinship, care, the endurance of relation under pressures. In Engine Empire, Cathy Park Hong turns futurity into critique rather than prophecy. Across its three sections, from the frontier town of Ballad of Our Jim to the algorithmic sprawl of the world cloud, Hong imagines worlds to come that are already collapsing under the weight of history. Her serial and polyphonic form mirrors systems in flux, industrial, digital, imperial. The result is a poetics of survival under technological acceleration, a future thinking that doesn't flee the present but exposes its unfinished catastrophes and fragile continuities. In conclusion, what I tried to trace today is how magical realism operates within the expanding field of speculative poetry, not as a borrowed genre, but as a flourishing mode where the marvelous and the real meet on equal terms. Magical realism keeps the marvelous socially legible and materially grounded. It holds ambiguity without abandoning history. It reroutes hope into continuance as care, ritual, and relation, and it offers a poetic that stays in the world and transforms it from within. Across Ronda's 5 modalities, these gestures don't reject other speculative practices, they recast them. They turn the marvelous into method, attention, and relation. If the map I've drawn feels incomplete, that may be because the field itself is still forming, a moving constellation of poets, modes, and experiments. And within that constellation, magical realism remains one of its most vital processings, a way of reimagining the world not by leaving it, but by deepening our sense of what it already holds. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Martin. We will now quickly move to our last panelist, who is Nadia Iglesias. Oh yes, I can see you. If you could share your screen while I present you. Nadia is a final year undergraduate student pursuing a double degree in English Studies and Hispanic Philology at the University of Almería, and will graduate, or maybe already has, in 2025. Her academic interests include speculative fiction, myth and literature, contemporary and 20th century narrative, and the representations of marginalization in literary texts. And her talk today is called Framing the Contemporary Hero, Quotes, Journey, and the Reimagining of Myth and the Hero in the Name of the Wind. The floor is yours, Nadia, whenever you want.
Hi, thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to begin my talk by expressing my gratitude to the Tartalo Organizing Committee for giving me the opportunity to share this project with you. And I would also like to thank Dr. Lucía Presentación Romero Mariscal and Dr. Antonio Castro Balbuena, who supervised my final degree dissertation, which is the project on which this presentation is based. So, what happens when gods fall silent and the hero picks up the pen? Well, the tale changes. It becomes fluid, half memory, half performance. This presentation follows the voice of that hero, unreliable, brilliant, and burning with the need to be remembered. Good afternoon, my name is Nadia, and in this presentation I will speak about Quoth, the hero who picked up the pen. Let me begin by presenting The Name of the Wind. Published in 2007, this book was written by Patrick Rothfuss, and it is the first volume of the unfinished trilogy, the Kingkiller Chronicle. As a short summary, the novel is structured as a frame narrative in which Quoth, now hiding as Coat, recounts his life to a scribe called Chronicle. In a war-torn, medieval-inspired world pieced by the uncanny, Quoth appears to be a simple innkeeper, but is in fact central to the chaos of his society. From his childhood with the traveling Edemaru to the murder of his family by the mysterious Chandrian, his life becomes a quest for revenge. I will now briefly mention the genre of this book, which is contemporary epic fantasy, because the pre-existing forms expected in literary genres that Bakhtin proposed are a challenge in the context of contemporary epic fantasy. As, aside from a few shared observations, the main authors and scholars who study this genre consider it a fuzzy set, following Atterbury's terminology. Nonetheless, after revising a few of the most outstanding definitions for the genre that I have found, among them Todorov's, Mendelssohn, Grant and Klutz, Cáceres Blanco, or Castro Balbuena, there are three main characteristics common to all of them: the myth, the hero, and the fictional world. And I would like to point out the importance of myth in The Name of the Wind, as Rothfuss incorporates a web of myths to flesh out his fictional universe. From the myth that explains the origin of his world to the legends of Tabelin the Great and Quoth's own, as we will see, this mythological background will be the previous knowledge that Quoth will use to build his own legend. Let us turn to the analysis of the protagonist of The Name of the Wind. And I will begin by observing the similarities that can be found between Quoth and the classic model of hero. This analysis is based on archetypal criticism, taking Jung's theory as a base, as it is crucial to note his concept of the collective unconscious and the archetypes, which he defined as archaic or primordial types that have existed since the remotest times. Here, I will observe how the archetype of the hero is presented in contemporary epic fantasy through the example of Quoth and how this primordial type has changed. I have also used a more contemporary depiction of the heroic archetype, the one proposed by Sarah Iles Johnston. She focuses on the classical hero, which I know is a tricky term to use because it is very ambiguous and broad, but I will use it to refer to the heroic model proposed by this author, who herself admitted that classic heroes represent a very heterogeneous group. She mentions 10 features that you can see in the slide, such as the divine origin, being a good warrior, or the killing of monsters. So first, I will examine two features identified by Johnston that are absent from Quo's story, so far as the first two volumes of the trilogy cover: the divine past and the aid of gods. So Quoth explicitly denies divine influence when he states, "But there was no one there to see the truth of things, and there was no God guiding it, only me." And he openly declares himself an atheist. While certain elements, such as meta-literary reflections on the divine origin of heroes or the emphasis on religion in the narration, may suggest a connection to the divine, these remain just speculative hints, and so far no clear evidence links Quoth directly to any deity. And now I will focus on some traits that Quoth does share with traditional heroes. First, his exceptional intelligence and physical skill. His mentor Ben highlights his brilliance early on, and at the university, Quoth excels quickly, being admitted very young and advancing faster than any peer. He is consistently portrayed as a witty and resourceful character, surviving poverty and isolation. Given the genre, I consider that his magical prowess is also central. Rothfuss's world features three magical disciplines: sympathy, symmetry, and naming, and Quoth excels in two. For instance, about his secondary learning process, he declares, "Most students took at least a month of study before Kamar judged them ready to move on. Some students took an entire term. Start to finish, it took me 7 days." And physically, he also proves heroic. Early in the book, he defeats several Skraels, which are some spider-like monstrous creatures that you can see in the picture of the slide. And after defeating the Skraels, his companion's vast reaction proves to the reader that this battle must not have been easy at all, and that, in fact, Quoth has acted heroically, as his companions claims. "You should be dead. You should be dead twice." Furthermore, Johnston mentions the killing of monsters, and Quoth kills what he insists on calling a dragon, which is in fact a drug-addicted common raccoon with abstinence syndrome, which is presented as a more or less peaceful creature. And despite this, Quoth states, "Very well, it was a dragon." So this choice reveals an example of meta-heroic literature where the hero protagonist of the story is aware of the heroic tradition within which he is framed, as the dragon is the quintessential adversary in many heroic adventures. Another aspect that Quoth shares with canonical heroes is that his adventure is structured as a journey, a path. So to analyze this aspect, I have used Campbell's theory of the monomyth, which is depicted as a structure present in myth and literature that describes a universal pattern found in heroic stories across cultures. It is divided into three main parts: the departure, the initiation, and the return, and they are likewise subdivided into different parts. I have analyzed the sections included in the departure phase, which are the ones listed in the slide, and the roads of trials, which is the first step in the initiation phase. So the call to adventure is represented in the name of the wind through the murder of Quoth's troop by the Chandrian, as it is when he is pushed to a zone unknown. Quoth even acknowledges that this is the beginning of his quest, as he claims, "It is the hinge upon which the story pivots like an opening door. In some ways, this is where the story begins." The following step is the refusal of the call, which are the years that Quoth spent in a state of complete vagrancy, first in the forest and then living in Tabin. He states that, "In the beginning, I was almost like an automaton, thoughtlessly performing the actions that would keep me alive." Next, we have the supernatural aid received to continue the journey, and Quoth decides to leave for the university after reading the inscription of the book that Ben gifted him, which said, "Defend yourself well at the university. Make me proud." And last in this first part of the journey, we have the crossing of the first threshold, which is represented in Quoth's path by his admission to the university, as it is the place where Quoth can both learn information about the mysterious Chandrian and also the name of the wind, which is a power that will help him defeat this Chandrian. Lastly, I will mention the roads of trial, which, as its name indicates, consist of a series of trials that the hero has to face. A few examples of these trials are the threat of expulsion from university, his lack of money, his learning process, or the fight with a dragon. And now that we have seen how Quoth is similar to the classic hero, let's observe which of his features make him unique and different from this model. For this purpose, I have used a different heroic archetype proposal, which is the theory of the Twilight hero introduced by Antonio Castro Albuena, who studies crepuscular heroes, a model closer to human beings. This chart shows the main features of the Twilight hero, where I highlight the fallibility, the marginalization, or the shadow, among others. So, Quoth, as a crepuscular hero, displays moral ambiguity. For instance, in Tarbin, he steals to survive and he admits, I discovered the proper way to slit a purse and pick a pocket. My nimble fingers were put to a use my parents or Aventhy never would have guessed. And he is constantly lying to his friends. He says, instead, he had done a friend's duty, helping me pass a difficult time, and I had repaid him with lies. So these traits reflect a hero who operates in the grey space between good and evil. And then we have that Castro Albuena also notes that such heroes often evoke empathy. And in Quo's case, Rothfuss presents his crimes alongside vivid depiction of hardship, almost presenting his suffering as an excuse for Quo's action, making his behavior questionable rather than presenting it as erroneous. For instance, I had become an accomplished beggar and thief. I was still ragged and frequently hungry, but I was in no real danger of starving. And finally, Quoth oscillates between being a savior and being a destroyer, a duality frequent in Twilight heroes. For instance, he rescues his colleague Fela from a fire, and he says, I had saved Fela, rushed into the fire and carried her to safety. It was my first taste of being a hero. And yet the interlude chapters describe a collapsing world marked by fear, war, and economic decline. And by the end of the book, Quoth suggests that he is responsible. He claims, all of this is my fault, the Skreol, the war, all my fault. And another crucial aspect that makes Quoth so original is that he is not only the hero of the story, but also its narrator. His version of events is carefully shaped, influenced by the tales he grew up with and the image he wants to project. Different strategies are used in the storytelling to create Quoth's myth. For instance, he compares himself to Taborlin the Great, a fictional ideal hero, inviting the reader to draw parallels between this traditional shaped hero and Quoth. For instance, he says, I went to learn magic of the sort they talk about in stories. Magic like Taborlin the Great. Moreover, meta-literary commentary also appears when Quoth and his listeners discuss the hero's journey, showing their awareness of narrative conventions. And in addition, Quoth consciously seeks to appear heroic. For instance, when planning to fight the dragon, he dismisses a practical idea by stating, It's not very heroic, I said dismissively. I was expecting something with a little more flair. And now I will conclude my analysis by mentioning how Quoth has a dual nature as a hero, represented by two of his personalities, Quoth and Coat. Coat has lost his powers, engages in mundane tasks, is related to the symbol of silence, and is described as a man who is waiting to die. His companion Bast wants to recover his master's spirit, and he reveals to Chronicler, the scribe, the place where Quoth is hiding, because he thinks that by recounting his adventures, Coat will get his heroic nature back. Bast says, People saw him as an innkeeper a year ago. He took off the mask when they walked out the door. Now he sees himself as an innkeeper. So this duality between Quoth and Coat encapsulates the central tension of the Name of the Wind, which is the contrast between the hero as myth and the hero as man. Quoth embodies the legendary qualities expected of an epic fantasy protagonist. Yet, in Coat, the withdrawn and disillusioned innkeeper, we witness the aftermath of heroism stripped of its narrative sheen. So as we come to the close of this presentation, I would like to weave together the central arguments that have shaped this analysis. To begin with, Quoth represents a kaleidoscopic, multifaceted hero who both echoes classical heroes with whom he shares many features, and yet is marked by fallibility, moral ambiguity, and human vulnerability. Hence, he can be considered a descendant of classical heroes and also a product of contemporary conditions. The Name of the Wind revitalizes the heroic tradition, as Rothfuss is inspired by the molds and models followed by heroes throughout history, mythology, and literature, and yet presents a protagonist who is closer to humans than to any divine creature. Quo's journey touches on themes like poverty, grief, and spiritual disconnection, reflecting the fractured realities of the 21st century, where heroes are no longer idealized paragons, but deeply flawed, humanized characters wrestling with their legacies. Thank you very much. Here are the works cited that I have mentioned in this presentation, and now if anyone has any question, I'll gladly answer any of them.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nadia. We will now have a couple of minutes for any person in the audience or at home. We will also be reading any messages that are left in the chat. Any questions for our three presenters in the room? No questions for the moment. You need some time to think. I can start with the Q&A if you want. I've got many questions, but just because I'm more familiar, although I did read The Name of the Wind many, many, many years ago, so I've forgotten a lot of the things that you mentioned, Nadia. I was wondering if you could delve a little bit more on the last bit that you mentioned of Quoth as a myth maker, because of this, because at the end of the day is kind of like an autobiographical myth creation, right? Because he's writing this, he's orally transmitting this to the inn, if I remember correctly, right? So you've got this component of the myth, that's oral tradition and transmission, but from an unreliable narrator. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what this unreliability implies for the figure of himself as a hero, as a tragic hero. The Twilight hero that you mentioned, if that has anything to do with it. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, so thank you. The thing is that the part that I'm most interested in about my analysis was how Quoth builds his myth, not only based on his real experience as a hero, but also as a very unreliable person, because he admits that he's a liar. And one of the things that he asked chronicler, the scribe, to do when he is orally transmitting his story is that he can't change a single word of what he is saying. So he is the only controller of his narration, and thus his unreliability, because he admits all the time that he is going to lie if he needs to. So even more as the trilogy is unfinished, I think that Quoth is presented as a very unreliable narrator, and thus his representation as a Twilight hero, because he is not presented as a noble person throughout the story. He's just someone who is trying to survive, and he do whatever he has to do to get his purpose. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Any other questions for Alicia or Martin We may be running out of time, yes. No more questions here, because we may need to start. Do we have everyone from? Yes, we do. All right. Nothing. Should I come? Okay, well, I'm sorry. We will now move on to the second session of the afternoon. We've got a different chair now, but if you could just stay here, maybe at the end we can do a summary of everything and we can leave all of the questions for the end. Yes, but thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for all of you who joined us at home, and a big round of applause for our three presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.